And joining us now, David Hlynsky. He is a lecturer in photography and new media at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, and we're happy to have you in at TVO tonight.
Thank you.
There's been, of course, a great deal of interest in the end of the so-called Warsaw Pact, or the Eastern Bloc countries, with the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you, I guess in the late 1980s for 4 years, took 8,000 photographs across Eastern Europe and in Moscow, concentrating on the shop windows in that part of the world. Why shop windows?
Actually, I started out just photographing scenes on the street, pedestrians and so forth. I wanted to try and avoid dramatic images because we were seeing a lot of that coming out of the news services and out of Hollywood. And I wanted to get images of the most banal parts of the society, because I think that we can learn a lot by looking at things that are boring in a place rather than looking at things that are overly dramatic.
Well, let's take an example here. We'll bring up your first picture. This is a shop window in Moscow.
Yes.
And the text, there's 3 words here. The text is, I gather, once translated, ambrosia, nectar, and juice.
That's right.
What are you seeing here?
What I'm seeing there is a kind of inversion of Western advertising, and I think that's what drew me to the store windows.
What does that mean?
In the West,
inversion?
In the West, well, if you look at that image, it says ambrosia ? And it's actually even phonetic. It says ambrosia in Russian, but it's pronounced the same way. Nectar, it's even the same pronunciation, ? And it says juice. Now in the West, we wouldn't do that. We would never do that. We would say, we wouldn't dare say that it was, is it nectar, is it ambrosia? No, it's colored water with corn syrup in it and flavoring, right? We would say, is it colored water with corn syrup and flavoring? No. Is it something more than that? No, it's ambrosia. It's nectar. And then there would be a little cartoon figure dancing across.
So you've got it opposite.
Yeah, it would be the opposite.
The way we do it.
Yeah.
And you inferred from that what?
I inferred from that that one of the main differences between the East Bloc and the West Bloc, especially during the late part of the Cold War, was a difference in our material values, and that's expressed by the way we market things. If you can imagine a big shopping plaza in the West being a museum, and the museum held all of our goods and all of our services and all of our values, cultural values, almost by accident. The streets in Eastern Europe during this time with these store windows were a kind of ad hoc museum of those material values.
Well, let's take a look at another room in the museum then, shall
Sure.
we? Here's one, next one if you could. Yeah, it just simply says milk, right?
Yes, this is it's a beautiful picture. I think it's got nice clouds in it, the beautiful drapery, and if you could look closer at it, it would be a number of containers of milk, and then a few eggs in a bowl. But the signage says Moloko, which just says milk. Period.
No brand.
No brand. It's not Mike's Milk, Mac's Milk, Mark's Milk. It's not super fortified milk. It's just milk. So that made these shopping environments much simpler to navigate than they are in the West. I think that
simpler because there was nothing in them.
Well, it's not true that there was nothing in them. There were things in them, and they were the same kinds of things that we needed, but they weren't filled with fantasy and color. In the West, we have all of our products are branded, and especially if you pay a lot of money for a product, you pay a lot of money for the fantasy that's associated with it. And our commercials are all about that fantasy. And when people said that the East Bloc cities were drab and gray, I'd like you to imagine driving down Yonge Street and blotting out all of the store windows and all of the commercial advertising in the billboards, and what would be left would be cement and drab and gray. So if you can imagine a society where everybody was buying no-name products and there was no advertising, then it is a little bit simpler. It doesn't mean that there were quite a few, I mean, there were a lot fewer goods there in terms of quantity, but they needed the same kinds of things that we needed.
Here's one more photo that we want to show, and this again is a very simple image. No words in this one at all. What are you trying to capture here?
This is a vending machine in Moscow, and the interesting thing about the machine is that it's got a glass in it and a little place where you can wash the glass afterwards. So you put your money in a machine and it dispenses juice or something, some kind of liquid into that glass, and you drink it, and you put it into the little squeegee and you clean it up and
leave it for the next guy?
and leave it for the next guy.
Well, you wouldn't do that here, would you?
You wouldn't do that here, but I wonder, you know, we think that we're so superior not to do that, and it's probably sanitary, for sanitary reasons. But imagine all the bottles, the water bottles that we throw out, all of the cups that we throw out.
So the Russians were environmentalists before we were.
I don't think they're especially environmentalists, but I think that we should question the what we see as luxury and disposability and all of that. We see that as superior, and it might not be the right answer either.
You think we still see it that way? I don't know. My hunch is that we've moved on from that. We don't necessarily see that kind of largesse and wastefulness as being particularly wonderful Western quality.
But we can't avoid it. I mean, try to get a glass of water someplace without having to buy a plastic bottle at the same time.
Right, okay. How do the shop windows reflect, in your view, the lack of personal freedom that, of course, we heard so much about in the West during this time?
I'm not so sure that I think that there are a number of different kinds of freedom that we talk about in the West. We talk about freedom of religion, freedom of expression, political freedoms. And I think the store windows express another kind of freedom that's very important to us, but we don't usually put it in this grouping. And that's the freedom to shop, the freedom to buy, the freedom to consume. And the free market was one of the distinguishing differences between the East Bloc and the West Bloc. In the West Bloc, free enterprise allows for all kinds of competition, all kinds of products. In the East Bloc, everything was government-made, factory-made, and no name.
Well, when they shopped, they had 90% fewer brands than we did, and you lined up for hours and hours to get the crap that they did offer, right?
You didn't always line up for hours and hours. When I spent time traveling with people who actually lived there, they didn't actually, I suppose sometimes they did spend hours and hours, but they also went to antique markets and bought things on the street and walked home with them. A friend of mine would drive through the city, through the countryside, and he would drive into a small town, and he would scour the place to find out what was available. And there would be surpluses in various places, and he would buy that stuff and stockpile it. So his own home had a room in it that had stockpiles of all of this stuff. And I suppose that most of his neighbors also did too. And if somebody wanted something, they would first call their neighbors and find out who had it.
But you tell me, maybe I'm reading between the lines here, you tell me if I'm off base here, but I am sensing in you a kind of almost appeal in the lack of choice that they had.
No, I don't think there's an appeal in it necessarily, but I don't think that there's a great advantage in having all of the choice that we have. I mean,
100 brands of shampoo is too much.
I don't want to be sacrilegious about it, you know. I mean, I do live in a capitalist country, and I am a consumer, and I love doing it. I love shopping as much as anybody, and I wouldn't take that away from us. But I just think it's an awful lot of work to be a consumer. I think it's our civic duty to consume as much as we can, as fast as we can, but it takes up an awful lot of spiritual energy to consume the right things, to stay fashionable, to stay on top of things.
100 brands of shampoo can sometimes be
ridiculous,
mind-boggling, can't it?
I mean, sometimes I go into a grocery store to buy a box of cereal. It takes me 20 minutes because I'm reading all the ingredients, especially if I'm health conscious.
Well, tell me this, how did materialism in Eastern Europe and in Russia change while you were there?
When I was in Moscow, I was in Moscow in 1990, and the East Bloc, the European colonies or whatever, the satellites had fallen. There was a McDonald's, and it was just opened in Moscow. There was a lineup 2 blocks around the place. People were waiting all day long to get into McDonald's. I think that's was kind of silly. A couple of years later, I went back to Prague after the change had happened, and I had a really distinct kind of gut feeling that somebody had taken a giant hypodermic syringe and plunged it into the center of Wenceslas Square and was squeezing capital, squeezing money into the pavement, and it was oozing out across the city. The farther you got away from that center, the more it felt like the old system. But right at that center, suddenly there was gambling and sports bars and strip clubs.
What'd you think of all that?
Pizza places. I think that everybody has a right to join whatever circus they want, and I wouldn't want to stop that. right?
Well,
But
since
it did get very noisy. It did, and I think that some people, if you're young and ambitious and you've got a lot of energy, you can certainly survive that.
let me ask you about sex, because
Yes.
you wrote in an essay about, you know, we use sex, of course, in the West to sell absolutely everything.
Everything. Absolutely.
Everything. You wrote, though, it seemed that sex wasn't employed to sell anything but itself. What did that mean?
I think that, I don't think that there was a lot of sex in the advertising at all. In fact, it was almost a puritanical, on the surface, it seemed like almost a puritanical society. And I would expect that the government would come down heavily in some moral fashion against sexual expression. That's more of a conservative Western view, I think. There were strip clubs and casinos and pornography in kiosks on the streets in Budapest. I was totally surprised under communism that was allowed, and it was part of the ordinary business. It just wasn't, sex wasn't used to sell cars. It wasn't used to sell, you know, clothes, fashion, travel, all of the things that sex sells here.
Gotcha. Last 30 seconds, let me ask you one more thing. I presume if you go to most of these Eastern Bloc countries today, the downtowns and the store windows look a lot like they do in the West now, right?
Somewhat, yeah. There are a lot of franchises from the West.
Yeah. Do you think something has been lost because of that?
Yes, I was asked that question a couple of days ago, and it took me a while to come to it. I think that what's lost is a kind of philosophical diversity. We talk about the loss of biological diversity. I think it's possible to lose intellectual or cultural or philosophical diversity. That doesn't mean that they had a good system. It just means that now that that's gone, we don't have anything to compare our system to.
Right. But you've got it on film, so good for
I do.
you. David Hlynsky, lecturer in photography, University of Toronto, Scarborough. Thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.